There is a sound a crowd makes when something goes wrong in front of them. Not a gasp, not quite a scream, but a collective intake of breath, as if 1,000 people forgot how to exhale at the same moment. That sound rose from the courtyard of Caldrith Palace on a gray Tuesday morning, and it started the instant a gloved hand closed around Duchess Muriel's wrist. She had been recovering for 11 days. 11 days since the collapse that no one outside the family fully understood, 11 days of drawn curtains and hushed physicians, and a husband who had barely left her side. This was supposed to be her first walk in the open air, 5 careful minutes near the fountain, nothing more. Instead, it became the morning the entire kingdom watched Prince Alden's composure shatter in public for the first time in his life. What the guard didn't know, what almost no one standing in that courtyard knew, was exactly how close to the edge the Duchess still was. What he also didn't know was that the prince had spent 11 sleepless nights promising himself, silently, that he would never again stand by while someone hurt her. He was about to keep that promise in front of half the palace staff, 3 visiting dignitaries, and a woman who would later say she had never seen a royal look so much like an ordinary, furious husband. This is the story of the 5 minutes that changed how Caldrith's guard was trained forever, and the 11 days that led up to them. The morning had started the way careful mornings do, with too much planning for too small an event. Duchess Muriel had not left her private wing in over a week. The physicians had been firm about it. Rest, quiet, no exertion, no stress. She had obeyed all of it without complaint, which worried Prince Alden more than if she had fought him on every point. Muriel was not a woman who obeyed quietly. She was a woman who had once walked 3 miles in the rain rather than accept a carriage she considered an unnecessary fuss. Her stillness these past 11 days had felt less like recovery and more like retreat, and Alden had spent every one of those days watching her for signs that she was slipping further away from herself rather than closer to healing. The collapse had happened without warning. One moment she had been standing at the edge of the winter garden, describing to her lady's companion the shape she wanted for a new hedge border. The next, she was on the ground, and the world Alden had built his entire adult life around had tilted sideways in a way it had never tilted before. The physicians used careful words, exhaustion, a strain on the heart brought on by weeks of grief she had not allowed herself to properly feel, a body that had been holding too much for too long and finally refused to hold any more. They did not use the word collapse in their reports. They called it an episode of acute physical distress. Alden had stopped listening to their careful words after the 3rd day and had simply watched his wife instead, learning the particular pallor of her skin when she was tired versus when she was in real danger, learning to read the set of her jaw when pain was worse than she was letting on. By the 11th day, the physicians agreed she could take short walks in fresh air, provided someone remained close by and the outing was brief. Muriel had asked, quietly, if she could see the fountain in the east courtyard, the one with the stone herons, the one she used to visit every morning before all of this happened. It was such a small request that Alden could not have refused it even if every physician in the kingdom had told him to. He arranged it himself. He did not delegate it to a steward or a scheduling clerk, which was unusual for a man whose days were normally organized down to the quarter hour by people whose entire job was to manage his time. He walked the route himself the evening before, checking the ground for uneven stones, making sure the bench near the fountain was positioned in partial shade rather than full sun. He told the household guard captain, personally, that the Duchess required a clear, quiet path, and that no one was to crowd her or rush her or treat this outing as anything other than what it was. A woman taking her first careful steps back into her own life. What he did not account for was a new addition to the palace guard rotation. A broad-shouldered man named Cade, recently transferred from the outer garrison, who had been briefed on palace security protocols, but had never once been briefed on the particular fragility of the woman he was assigned to help protect that morning. Cade had spent the better part of his career guarding warehouses and border checkpoints, where the primary skill required was decisiveness, moving people quickly, firmly, without hesitation, because hesitation on a border checkpoint could cost lives. He was good at his job in the way a hammer is good at driving nails. He had been told that morning to ensure the courtyard remained clear during the Duchess's walk. He had not been told how to do that gently. No one had thought to tell him, because no one imagined it would need saying. The morning began well. Muriel walked slowly on her husband's arm, a lady's companion trailing a respectful distance behind, and for the first few minutes it seemed the outing would be exactly the small, healing thing everyone had hoped for. She stopped at the edge of the fountain, watching the stone herons with an expression Alden had not seen on her face in nearly 2 weeks, something close to peace. Word of the Duchess's first walk had spread through the palace faster than anyone anticipated. By the time she reached the fountain, a small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance, kitchen staff who had worked in the palace long enough to remember Muriel before she was a duchess, when she was simply a woman who used to bring them bread from the village on cold mornings. A handful of junior clerks who had never seen her at all and were simply curious. 2 visiting dignitaries from a neighboring house who happened to be crossing the courtyard at the wrong moment and stopped to watch out of politeness disguised as curiosity. Cade saw the gathering crowd and reacted the only way his training had ever taught him to react to a crowd near a person he was assigned to protect. He moved to clear it, fast and without much regard for who was standing where. The lady's companion was the first to be moved, a firm hand on her shoulder, steering her back several paces before she had time to protest. A kitchen maid was next, waved off with a curt gesture. And then, because Muriel had drifted a few steps from Alden's side, toward the crowd of staff she recognized, reaching out instinctively toward a woman she had known for years. A woman who had cried with joy simply to see her upright and walking. Cade reached for the nearest person he perceived as being too close to his charge. He did not realize, in the half-second it took him to act, that the person too close to the Duchess was the Duchess herself. His hand closed around Muriel's wrist to pull her back from what he read as an unauthorized approach by a member of staff. It was not a violent grip. It was, by the standards of a man trained to move people out of dangerous proximity to threats, an entirely ordinary and even restrained gesture. But Muriel's body, still healing, still 11 days removed from a collapse no one fully understood, had not been braced for any hand at all. She staggered, her balance failing in an instant, a small sound of pain escaping her before she could stop it. That sound was the one that changed everything. Alden turned at the sound before his mind had even finished processing what had happened. He saw his wife stumbling, saw a stranger's gloved hand still fastened around her wrist, saw the flash of pain cross her face that she was too proud and too startled to hide. 11 days of careful, controlled worry. 11 days of watching her sleep just to make sure her breathing stayed even. 11 days of holding his own fear at arm's length so that he could be strong enough for both of them, broke apart in the space of a single heartbeat. He crossed the distance between them in a few long strides, and the voice that came out of him was not the voice the palace was used to hearing. It was not measured. It was not diplomatic. It was raw, low, and carried a warning that made 3 separate members of staff take an involuntary step backward. "Don't touch her." Cade released Muriel's wrist immediately, some instinct in him recognizing danger even before his conscious mind had caught up to what was happening. But Alden was already between them, one arm sliding around his wife to steady her, his body angled so that he stood fully between Muriel and the guard who had grabbed her. A wall of a man who had, until that moment, been known throughout Caldrith for his patience. "She collapsed 11 days ago," Alden said, and his voice, though quieter now, had lost none of its edge. 11 days. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand what it means to put a hand on a body that has not finished healing? Cade opened his mouth, to explain, to apologize, to say he had not known who she was reaching toward, that he had been doing exactly what his training told him to do, but no words came. What could he say that would not sound like an excuse for having hurt her? The crowd had gone utterly silent. The 2 visiting dignitaries exchanged a glance that would, within the hour, become the seed of a story told in at least 2 other royal courts. The kitchen maid whom Muriel had been reaching toward stood frozen, her hand still half raised, as though the gesture of greeting had simply stopped mid-motion and forgotten how to finish. "Alden," Muriel's voice, though still shaky, cut through the tension with the particular firmness she used when she believed her husband was about to do something he would later regret. "Alden, look at me." He did not look away from Cade. "Alden," she said his name again, softer this time, and something in her tone finally reached him. He turned, and the fury in his face dissolved instantly into something far more fragile, fear, plain and unguarded. The fear of a man who had almost lost his wife once and had spent 11 days terrified he might lose her again. "Are you hurt?" His hands moved over her arms, her shoulders, checking without quite touching, the way a person checks a fragile object for cracks. "Muriel, are you hurt?" "I'm fine," she said, though the paleness of her face suggested otherwise. "I'm fine. It startled me, that's all. Please." Her hand found his arm, gripping it. "Please don't do this here, not like this." But it was already done. The courtyard had already witnessed it. And somewhere in the crowd, a junior clerk who had arrived at the palace only 3 months earlier was already composing, in his head, the version of this story he would tell his family that evening. A version that would spread through the kitchens and the stables and the guardhouse by nightfall, growing a little with each retelling, until the entire kingdom of Caldrith knew that Prince Alden had nearly come to blows with a member of his own guard over his wife's wrist. What none of them yet understood, not the crowd, not the guard captain who would be summoned within the hour, not even Alden himself in the white heat of that first fury, was that this moment in the courtyard was not really about a hand on a wrist at all. It was about 11 days of a fear too large to speak aloud, finally finding somewhere to go. Muriel allowed her husband to guide her toward the bench near the fountain, away from the crowd, away from Cade, who stood rooted to the spot, his face drained of color, waiting for whatever judgment was about to fall on him. The lady's companion hurried forward with water. The dignitaries, sensing correctly that they had witnessed something not meant for outside eyes, began a quiet, tactful retreat toward the palace doors. Alden knelt in front of his wife, taking both her hands in his anger already burning down into something quieter and more exhausted. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have." "You were protecting me." Muriel's thumb brushed against his knuckles. "I know what that looked like to everyone else, but I know what it actually was. It looked like I lost control of myself in front of half the palace." "You did," she said it gently, without judgment. "You have been holding yourself together for 11 days, Alden. Something was going to give eventually. I would rather it be this than you breaking apart somewhere no one could help you." He pressed his forehead briefly against her hands, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the sound of the fountain filling the silence between them. Behind them, at a careful distance, Cade remained standing exactly where he had been left, unsure whether he was meant to stay or go, unsure whether the next person to approach him would be a guard captain with a reprimand or someone worse. He would not have long to wonder. Word of what had happened in the east courtyard was already moving through the palace faster than any messenger could have carried it, and by the time the sun reached its highest point that day, the guard captain, the head of household staff, and most unexpectedly of all, Duchess Muriel herself would each have something to say about what should happen next. But that reckoning would come later. For now, in the quiet after the storm, there was only a husband kneeling before his wife by a fountain of stone herons, and a guard standing frozen nearby, and a courtyard slowly emptying of witnesses who would spend the rest of the day retelling, in hushed and excited voices, the 5 minutes when the kingdom of Caldrith saw its most composed prince become, for once, simply a terrified husband. The fountain kept running. The herons kept their eternal, silent watch. And somewhere behind the palace's tall windows, a household of servants and courtiers began quietly preparing for the conversations that would follow, conversations that would reveal far more about Prince Alden, about Duchess Muriel, and about the guard named Cade than any of them yet realized. The guard captain's name was Bram, and he had served House Caldrith for 19 years, long enough to remember Prince Alden as a boy who used to sneak into the training yards to watch the recruits spar, long enough to have taught the young prince his first proper sword stance. When word reached him of what had happened at the fountain, he did not run. Running would have suggested panic, and panic was not something Bram allowed himself in front of his men. But he walked faster than he had walked in years, and by the time he reached the guardhouse, his jaw was set in a way that made 2 junior guards clear out of his path without being told to. He found Cade exactly where he expected to find him, standing at rigid attention just inside the guardhouse door, still in his full uniform, staring straight ahead at nothing. The younger man's face had not regained its color. "Report," Bram said, though he had already heard 3 different versions of the story on his way over, each one slightly more dramatic than the last. Cade told it plainly, without excuse, which was the first thing that told Bram this was not a man trying to save himself. He described the crowd gathering, the instinct to clear it, the reach for a figure moving toward his charge, the horrifying half-second realization of who that figure actually was. He did not soften any part of it. He did not claim he had been given insufficient instruction, though that was, in fact, entirely true. He simply stated what had happened and then stood, waiting, as though bracing for a blow. "You grabbed the Duchess." "Yes, sir." 11 days after her collapse. "I did not know, sir. I was told to keep the courtyard clear. No one told me." He stopped himself. "That's not an excuse. I should have looked before I reached." Bram studied him for a long moment. He had dismissed guards before for far less than laying hands on a member of the royal family, even accidentally, even with good intentions behind the action. The protocol was clear. The protocol did not care about intentions. And yet something about the younger man's stillness, his refusal to shift blame even when blame was clearly available to him, gave Bram pause. "You transferred from the outer garrison 3 weeks ago." "Yes, sir." "Border work." "Checkpoint duty, sir, 4 years." Bram nodded slowly, understanding beginning to form. Checkpoint work bred a particular kind of instinct, fast, decisive, physical. It was exactly the instinct that made a man excellent at stopping smugglers, and dangerous exactly the wrong instinct for standing near a recovering woman in a quiet courtyard. It was not incompetence. It was a mismatch between a man's training and the task he had been handed, and that mismatch was, in the end, not entirely Cade's fault. "Wait here," Bram said, and went to find the prince. He found Alden not in his private study, where he might have expected, but still near the east courtyard, sitting on the edge of the fountain's stone rim with his elbows on his knees and his head bowed, alone. Muriel had been persuaded some time ago to return to her rooms to rest, and Alden had apparently not been able to bring himself to leave the spot where it had happened. "Your Highness," Bram approached carefully, the way he might approach a man standing too close to a cliff edge. "I've spoken with the guard." Alden did not look up immediately. "Dismiss him." "Your Highness, if I may." He put his hands on her, Bram. Now he looked up, and his eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion rather than fresh anger. The fury of the courtyard had burned itself out, leaving only a bone-deep tiredness behind. 11 days. 11 days of watching her sleep to make sure she kept breathing. 11 days of pretending I wasn't afraid so that she wouldn't have to be afraid too. And the first time I let her out of that room, someone puts a hand on her wrist hard enough to make her cry out. "I understand, Your Highness, I do. But I ask that you hear the full account before deciding his fate." Bram sat, uninvited, on the fountain's edge a respectful distance away, a familiarity earned by 19 years of service, and by having once, a very long time ago, pulled a much younger Alden out of a river when the boy had gotten his foot caught between 2 rocks. He came from checkpoint duty, 4 years stopping smugglers at the border. He was never trained for palace work, not properly. He was moved here to fill a gap in the rotation, and no one thought to walk him through what it means to guard a person who is healing rather than a gate that needs holding. Alden said nothing, but his jaw tightened. He did not know it was the Duchess he was reaching for, Bram continued. He saw a figure moving toward his charge, and he did what 4 years of training told him to do. When he realized what he'd done, "Your Highness, I have seen guilty men in 19 years of this work, and I have seen men who are simply afraid of punishment. This is not that. This is a man who understands completely that he caused harm and who is not looking for a way out of the consequences. That doesn't undo what happened." "No," Bram agreed. "It doesn't. But dismissing him teaches this palace nothing except that mistakes get punished. It doesn't teach anyone how to avoid the mistake in the first place. And if I'm honest, Your Highness, this was as much a failure of preparation as it was a failure of the man. I assigned a checkpoint guard to a courtyard duty involving the Duchess's recovery, and I did not personally ensure he understood the sensitivity of the task. That failure sits with me before it sits with him." Alden was quiet for a long moment, watching the herons, watching the water fall in its endless, indifferent pattern over the stone. When he finally spoke, some of the exhaustion had settled into something closer to thought than fury. "What does Muriel say?" It was, Bram would think later, exactly the question he should have expected from this particular prince, whose marriage had always struck the guard captain as unusually equal for a royal match. A partnership rather than an arrangement. 2 people who genuinely consulted each other rather than one simply informing the other of decisions already made. "I haven't asked her, Your Highness. I came to you first." "Ask her," Alden said. "Whatever she decides, I'll agree to it." He would come to regret giving away that authority so easily, not because Muriel would decide poorly, but because what she decided would surprise him more than anything else that strange, long day had yet produced. Muriel received Bram in her private sitting room, propped against a mountain of cushions with a shawl around her shoulders, looking pale but considerably steadier than she had appeared by the fountain an hour before. She listened to Bram's account of Cade's history without interrupting, her expression unreadable, her fingers idly turning a small stone heron figurine that sat on the table beside her. A gift Alden had given her years ago, before either of them had imagined a life this large or this frightening. When Bram finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked a question that caught the guard captain entirely off guard. "Has anyone asked the young man how he's doing?" "Your Highness." "Cade, has anyone asked him how he's doing after this? Or has everyone in this palace spent the last hour deciding what should happen to him, without once considering what he must be feeling right now?" Bram, who had spent 19 years navigating the emotional terrain of palace life without ever once being asked a question quite like this one, took a moment to find his words. "I imagine he's frightened, Your Highness, and ashamed." "I imagine he is too." Muriel set the little stone heron down carefully. "I want to see him." "Your Highness, I'm not certain that's wise, given that he hurt me an hour ago. Bram, I have been surrounded for 11 days by people terrified of upsetting me, tiptoeing around every word, treating me as though I might shatter if someone raises their voice near me. I am tired of being protected from things. I want to see him." There was no arguing with that particular tone, one Bram recognized from years of watching Muriel navigate palace politics with a directness that had unsettled more than one visiting dignitary. He went to fetch Cade. The young guard entered the Duchess's sitting room as though walking toward his own execution, his shoulders squared in the manner of a man determined to face whatever punishment awaited without flinching, but his eyes betraying a fear far deeper than mere professional consequence. He stopped several paces from her chair and bowed, low and formal. "Your Highness, I have no excuse for what I did. I am prepared to accept whatever judgment you see fit." Muriel studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Sit down. Your Highness, there's a chair right there. Sit down. I don't enjoy conversations where one person is standing over the other like a disappointed schoolteacher." Confused but unwilling to disobey a direct instruction from the Duchess, Cade lowered himself stiffly into the chair across from her, perched at its very edge as though prepared to leap up at the first sign that this had been a trap. "Tell me about the border," Muriel said. "Your Highness, the checkpoint. Bram tells me you spent 4 years there before coming to the palace. Tell me what that work was like." It was not the conversation Cade had braced himself for, and it took him a moment to find his footing. Haltingly at first, then with more ease as Muriel asked careful, genuine questions, he described the work, the long hours, the constant vigilance required at a border crossing where smugglers grew more creative each season, the split-second decisions that could mean the difference between stopping something dangerous and letting it through. He described the training that had shaped him. Move fast, act decisively, hesitation costs lives. "And no one told you the palace required something different?" "No, Your Highness, not really. I was told the general protocols, where to stand, when to rotate, who to report to. No one explained that a recovering person needs to be approached differently than a threat needs to be stopped." He looked down at his hands. "That's not an excuse for hurting you. I should have looked before I reacted. I will carry that with me regardless of what happens next." Muriel watched him for a long moment, and something in his open, unguarded shame seemed to settle a decision in her that had perhaps already been forming since Bram first told her his story. "I believe you," she said finally. "I believe you did not know it was me, and I believe that if you had known, you never would have grabbed my wrist that way. That matters to me, Cade. Intent matters." Hope, cautious and disbelieving, flickered across the young guard's face. "But," Muriel continued, and the hope dimmed slightly in preparation for whatever came next, "I also believe this palace failed you before you ever failed it. You were placed in a role you weren't properly prepared for, and when the moment came that required a gentler instinct than the one you'd spent 4 years building, that instinct simply wasn't there to draw on. That is not entirely your fault. It is, however, entirely something we can fix." "Your Highness, I don't understand." "I'm not dismissing you," she said. "I'm going to ask Bram to build a proper training program, something that teaches guards the difference between stopping a threat and protecting someone who is fragile. You're going to help him build it, because you understand better than anyone here what that gap in training actually feels like from the inside. And you are going to personally ensure that no other guard in this palace ever makes the mistake you made today, because you, better than anyone, will know exactly how it happens. Cade stared at her, momentarily unable to speak. When he finally found his voice, it was rough with an emotion he did not try very hard to hide. "Your Highness, I don't know how to thank you for." "Don't thank me yet. This isn't a reward, Cade. It's a responsibility, and it's a harder one than simply being dismissed and sent back to the border. You will spend the next months thinking about this morning every single day, building a system meant to make sure it never happens to anyone else. That's not mercy. That's accountability with a purpose." He nodded, understanding settling over him with visible weight. "Yes, Your Highness, I understand." "Good." Muriel picked the stone heron back up, turning it over once in her fingers before setting it down again, a small habit Bram had noticed she returned to whenever a difficult conversation reached its resolution. "Now go tell Bram I've decided. And Cade," he paused at the door, looking back. "My husband loves me in a way that frightens him sometimes. What you saw in that courtyard was not really about you. It was 11 days of fear finally finding somewhere to go. I don't say that to excuse how he spoke to you, only so you understand it as what it actually was." Cade bowed again, deeper this time, and left the room considerably lighter than he had entered it. When Alden learned of Muriel's decision, Bram delivered the news carefully, watching the prince's face for any sign of the fury that had gripped him by the fountain. He was silent for a long moment, processing something that clearly did not match what he had expected. "She wants him to build a training program." "She does, Your Highness." "Not dismissed." "No, Your Highness." Alden let out a breath that seemed to carry with it some of the last of the day's tension. "Of course she does," he said, and there was something almost like a rueful smile beginning at the corner of his mouth. "She would rather build something out of a mistake than simply punish it away." He found her later that evening, back in her sitting room, the shawl still around her shoulders, looking tired but more settled than she had appeared in days. He sat on the edge of her chair, taking her hand, examining the faint mark still visible on her wrist where Cade's grip had left its brief impression. "You surprised me today," he said. "I surprise you most days. It's part of my charm." "I wanted him gone, Muriel. I wanted him gone from this palace within the hour." "I know." Her thumb traced the back of his hand. "That's why I made the decision instead of asking you to make it with a clear head. You weren't going to have a clear head about this today, Alden, and that's not a criticism. I nearly lost you 11 days ago, too, in a way you don't talk about, the way you must have felt, watching me collapse and not knowing if I would open my eyes again. You've been holding that fear the entire time I've been holding my own. Today it finally had somewhere to go." He pressed his forehead against her hand, the same gesture he had made by the fountain hours before, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "I don't deserve you," he said quietly. "No," she agreed, with the particular fondness that made the words land as affection rather than insult. "But you have me anyway, so you might as well get used to it." Outside, the palace had begun to settle into evening, the story of the morning's confrontation already spreading through every corner of Caldrith in a dozen different versions, most of them wildly exaggerated, a few of them remarkably close to the truth. In the guardhouse, Cade sat alone with a blank sheet of paper in front of him, beginning, hesitantly at first, then with growing purpose, to write down everything he wished someone had told him before that morning. What none of them yet knew, not Alden, not Muriel, not Bram, and certainly not Cade himself, still shaken and grateful and uncertain of his own footing, was that the training program born out of that single terrible morning would, within the year, become the standard used to prepare every guard assigned to royal protection duty throughout the kingdom. Nor did they know that the story of the courtyard, retold and reshaped by 100 different voices over the following weeks, would eventually reach ears far beyond the palace walls, including those of a neighboring house whose own guard captain would, upon hearing it, send a formal request asking whether Caldrith might be willing to share whatever it was they had built. But that was still ahead of them. For now, there was only a palace slowly quieting for the night, a husband and wife sitting together in the fading evening light, and a young guard writing by candlelight, turning the worst morning of his career into the beginning of something that would outlast all of them. 3 months passed, and the courtyard fountain with its stone herons became, without anyone quite deciding it should, something of a landmark in the story the palace told about itself. The training program that grew out of that single terrible morning did not happen quickly, and it did not happen easily. Bram had initially imagined something modest, a short addendum to the existing guard manual, a page or two outlining the difference between securing a perimeter and standing near someone who was healing. Cade, once he began writing, refused to let it stay modest. He worked on it most evenings after his regular duties ended, filling page after page with things he wished someone had told him on his first day in the palace. He wrote about the specific weight of a hand, how a grip that would be entirely appropriate for redirecting a stranger at a border checkpoint could leave a bruise on someone whose body had not finished healing. He wrote about reading a room instead of just watching it, about learning to recognize the difference between a crowd that posed a genuine risk and a crowd that was simply curious and harmless. He wrote more than once about the particular horror of realizing too late who you had reached for. Bram read every page, made corrections where his 19 years of experience suggested them, and slowly the modest addendum became something much larger. A full training module, eventually named, at Bram's insistence and over Cade's embarrassed objections, simply the Fountain Protocol, in honor of the morning that had made it necessary. Muriel took an interest in its development that surprised everyone, including herself. She could not help physically demonstrate techniques, not in her still recovering state, but she made herself available for something she considered more important. She talked to Cade, at length and on several occasions, about what it had actually felt like to be grabbed that morning. Not to punish him with the retelling, but because she understood, with an instinct that came from somewhere deeper than any training manual, that the guards being taught this protocol would learn it better from a real account than from an abstract rule. "Tell them what it felt like," she said to Cade one afternoon several weeks into his work when he had come to her with a draft passage he was uncertain about. "Not what you think it should have felt like, what it actually felt like, the surprise, the pain, how fast it happened. Guards who only read rules forget them. Guards who understand the reason behind a rule remember it." He took her advice, and the module grew richer for it, filled not with cold procedural language, but with something closer to a story. The story of one ordinary morning that had gone wrong in a way that could have been prevented, told honestly enough that anyone reading it would understand exactly why the rules mattered. Alden's role in all of this was quieter, though no less significant. In the days immediately following the courtyard confrontation, he had struggled with something he did not fully articulate even to Muriel, a private embarrassment at having lost control of himself so completely, so publicly, after a lifetime of being known throughout Caldrith for his measured temperament. He had built his reputation, deliberately and over many years, on being the steady one, the prince who did not raise his voice, who solved problems with patience rather than force. The courtyard had shown the entire palace a different version of himself, one he was not entirely sure he recognized. He raised this, eventually, with Muriel, on an evening when she was strong enough to walk the palace gardens properly for the first time since her collapse, no longer needing his arm for support, though he offered it anyway, and she took it anyway, because some habits, once formed in fear, took time to unlearn even after the fear itself had eased. "I keep thinking about how I looked that morning," he admitted. "The whole courtyard saw me shouting, grabbing for you like a man who'd lost his mind." "You had," Muriel said simply. "For about 90 seconds you absolutely had lost your mind. I watched it happen." "That's meant to be reassuring. It's meant to be honest." She stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "Alden, you have spent our entire marriage being the calm one, the reasonable one, the one who thinks 3 steps ahead before anyone else has thought one. Do you know what I thought, lying in bed that first night after my collapse, watching you pretend to read reports you clearly weren't absorbing a single word of? What did you think? I thought, he is so frightened, and he will not let himself show it, because he believes I need him to be strong more than I need him to be honest. And I let you believe that for 11 days, because I understood why you needed to. But it isn't true, Alden. I never needed you to be unshakable. I needed you to be exactly what you were in that courtyard. A man who loves me enough that watching someone hurt me, even by accident, even for half a second, broke through every careful, composed layer you'd built up over 11 days of pretending you weren't afraid. That's not the kind of prince the kingdom expects." "The kingdom doesn't have to watch you love your wife," Muriel said. I do. And I would rather have a husband who occasionally loses his composure because he cares too much than one who is so composed he's forgotten how to feel anything at all. She reached up, brushing a strand of hair back from his face with the easy familiarity of years spent together. You are allowed to be frightened, Alden. You are allowed to have a bad morning after 11 terrible days. I fell in love with a man who feels things deeply, not a man carved out of stone. Don't apologize to me for that ever again. He said nothing for a long moment, simply looking at her in the fading evening light, and something in his shoulders, tight since that morning at the fountain, finally began to ease. The formal announcement of the fountain protocol came 2 months after the incident, presented by Bram to the assembled palace guard in a ceremony far more solemn than the modest training document might have seemed to warrant. Every guard in the household rotation, from the newest recruit to the most senior officer, was required to complete it. Cade, standing at the front of the room beside Bram, delivered a portion of the training himself. The first time in his career he had spoken before an assembled group, rather than simply following orders within it. He spoke plainly, the way he had spoken to Bram on the worst day of his career, without embellishment or excuse. He described the morning at the fountain in enough detail that every guard in the room understood exactly how easily it could have happened to any of them, and exactly why it must never happen again. When he finished, the room was quiet in a way that suggested the lesson had landed somewhere deeper than mere procedure. Muriel and Alden attended the ceremony together, standing at the back of the hall rather than at the front, a small gesture that Bram understood immediately as deliberate. The Duchess did not want her presence to feel like a public relitigating of what had happened, only a quiet acknowledgement that something good had been built from something painful. Afterward, as the guards filed out to return to their duties, Cade approached the royal couple with a formality that had not entirely faded despite the months that had passed, and the trust that had slowly rebuilt itself between them. Your Highnesses, he bowed, I hope the protocol meets with your approval. It exceeds it, Muriel said, and meant it. You've built something that will protect people long after all of us are gone from this palace. That's a rare thing to be able to say about a single morning's mistake. Cade's expression shifted, something between pride and lingering guilt still visible beneath it. I still think about it. That morning, I don't think I'll ever stop thinking about it. Good, Alden said, and it was not unkind, only honest. I hope you never do. Not as punishment, but because a guard who has forgotten how easily harm can happen by accident is a guard who might let his guard down again. Carry it with you. Just don't let it become the only thing you carry. It was, perhaps, the closest thing to true forgiveness that had passed between the two men since that terrible morning by the fountain. Not a formal pardon, not a ceremonial gesture, but a simple acknowledgement, Prince to guard, that a mistake honestly reckoned with had become something worth keeping. The stone herons at the fountain remained exactly as they had always been, indifferent witnesses to whatever unfolded in their courtyard. And yet the space around them had changed in a way that was difficult to name but easy to feel. Staff who passed it now sometimes told the story to newer members of the household. The morning the prince's composure broke, the duchess's unexpected mercy, the guard who turned his worst mistake into a program that would outlast his own career. The story had grown a little in the retelling, as stories in palaces always do, but its essential shape remained true. A family that chose understanding over punishment, and a mistake that became, against every likely outcome, something worth having happened. Muriel's recovery continued steadily through those months, her strength returning in increments too small to notice day to day, but unmistakable when measured against where she had been. By the time the first anniversary of the incident approached, though no one called it an anniversary, not officially, it was simply the season when the gardens bloomed again. She was walking the palace grounds daily, unassisted, her collapse 11 months behind her and receding further with each passing week. She returned to the fountain often during that time, sometimes alone, sometimes with Alden, occasionally finding Cade there too, on his own time, tending in small unofficial ways to the space that had become, for him, something like a private memorial to the morning that had reshaped his entire understanding of his work. They did not always speak when their paths crossed there. Sometimes a nod was enough. An acknowledgement passed between three people who understood something about that particular courtyard that no one else in the palace could quite share. On one such evening, close to a year after the collapse that had started everything, Muriel found Alden sitting on the fountain's edge exactly where Bram had found him on that first terrible day, elbows on his knees, watching the water fall in its endless pattern over the stone herons. She sat beside him without a word, and for a while they simply watched the fountain together, the way they had watched it together countless times before the collapse, before the crowd, before the hand that closed too hard around her wrist. "Do you ever think about how differently it could have gone?" she asked eventually. "If Bram had dismissed him that day, if you hadn't let me decide." "Every day," Alden admitted. "I think about how close I came to making a decision out of fear instead of fairness. I think about what kind of prince I would have been if I'd let that fury make the choice instead of you." "You would have been forgiven for it. No one would have blamed you." "I would have blamed myself." He took her hand, turning it over gently, his thumb tracing the place on her wrist where the mark had long since faded, invisible now except in memory. "I keep thinking about what you said to me that evening, that you'd rather have a husband who feels things too deeply than one who's forgotten how to feel at all. I think about that a lot, actually. I think it might be the truest thing anyone's ever said to me. I have my moments." She leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the herons, watching the light shift gold and then gray as the evening settled in around them. "Do you know what I think about when I sit here?" "Tell me." "I think about how strange it is that the worst morning of the last year became the reason this palace is safer now than it's ever been. I think about Cade, who could have been dismissed and sent back to a life of border checkpoints, carrying nothing but shame, and instead built something that will outlast every one of us. I think about how close we came to losing something good, simply because everyone's first instinct was punishment instead of understanding." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't think that morning was a tragedy in the end. I think it was a test, and I think mostly we passed it." Alden pressed a kiss to the top of her head, the fountain's endless water filling the comfortable silence between them, the stone herons keeping their eternal watch over a courtyard that had, in its own quiet way, become the place where a family learned exactly what they were made of. The guardhouse lamp still burned some evenings, long after official duties ended, where Cade continued refining the protocol that bore the fountain's name, adding new sections as new lessons emerged, training new recruits with the same plain honesty that had first won Muriel's trust. He would go on, in the years that followed, to become one of the most respected instructors in the kingdom's guard, sought after by neighboring houses eager to build training programs of their own. His career shaped entirely by a single morning he had once believed would end it. And in the east courtyard, the stone herons watched the seasons turn, indifferent and eternal, keeping their silent record of the morning a prince's composure broke, and the far longer story of everything that broken moment eventually built.